Yeah. Hmm.
behind the Great Awakening. Ben Franklin, who you don't normally think of as a religious person, he does make a lot of money off of this, printing out Whitfield's sermons, which Whitfield, by the way, didn't write. And you'll find out in a little while why he didn't write those. But people would transcribe his sermons and they would give them to Franklin. But Franklin and Whitfield were great friends. There was every time, I mean, Whitfield traveled up and down the coast. And when he came to Philadelphia, he always had an open room in Ben Franklin's house. Ben just loved them, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And then so you see George Whitefield is the youngest of this crew that he's going to be dealing with. I guess I forgot something, or we only got the first slide. All the other slides are gone, Leah. That would cut me off real short. We can just start to talk, but there's, okay. So George Whitefield, there's a couple of important points here. George Whitefield was born in Gloucester. He was, his parents ran an inn, but his father died early in his life. So he was helping out in the inn. He had essentially no money, but he was a really smart guy. And he got to go to Oxford as what they call a servitor. A servitor is a cross between a servant and a student. So he was there. They got him through, he earned his way through school, but he was a servitor. So any student that had money, any professor that had money, they paid him. And they said, he's one of the guys you go to get all your work done. And that's how he got through college. Okay. And when he was in college, he met up with John Wesley and Charles Wesley, who had already started the Holy Club. Now, the Holy Club was a derogatory term, actually, but it stuck, okay? Because the people in the Holy Club, they would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. They were very disciplined. Whitefield, similar to like Luther, almost he hurt his body being so strict with it. I mean, he would go outside, lay down in the snow, prostrate himself until his hands turned black, okay? Because he thought that way he could become holy. He had not gone through his rebirth experience yet, but he wanted to know God, okay? And he thought that was the way that you did it. And then he realized that wasn't it, okay? But the Holy Club was, he was part of the Holy Club. They went out and did a lot of good works. But remember, this Holy Club was started at this time. John Wesley had not gone through his renewal experience when he had a change of heart. He heard he felt that change of heart. And he hadn't gone through that yet. They were, they thought that a lot of people in the university were less than holy. And they got together to keep themselves searching for God, but they would all admit that they hadn't found him yet. Okay, so he was part of that Holy Club, which kept to this high standard. Now, it's through Wesley that before Wesley has this change of heart, has the warming of the heart experience. He gives some literature to George Whitefield, and George Whitefield has this change of heart. He could still remember the place at Oxford where the light went off, okay? And he said, this isn't about, all these things. So he was best of friends with Wesley, but they did not agree on doctrine. They will agree many times. You'll see as we go through this, they helped each other out in their preaching. They communicated a lot. Whitefield, they were both Anglican priests, okay? That's important. Whitefield was a Calvinist, okay? A tulip Calvinist. And tulip is an acronym, and I probably forget what it says here, but a tulip is an acronym. The T stands for total depravity. So as compared to Wesley, unless God saved you, you didn't have a chance. Wesley was more of the idea that, you know, if there was 1% of you that wanted to get there, God could do the rest. Okay. But to a Calvinist, you were totally depraved. So tulip was T, U, yeah, I should remember all these things. Let me go back to that. L is limited atonement. The I is infinite grace, or no, it's not infinite. It's you can't deny the grace. Okay, it's irreversible grace, something like that. The P was perseverance. We all needed that. And the U stood for unlimited election. So people were elected, and once you were elected, you were there. Okay, there were the elected and there were the unelected. You didn't know who was elected, who was not elected. And his big thing when he was preaching is your preaching, when it reached the ear of an elected soul, then he was in. It wasn't your preaching per se, it was the gospel that did it. He had a famous quote that many people can preach better than I, but no one has a better gospel. Okay, because that's the gospel. It's the gospel that changes you, not what you do. Well, anyways, so he becomes a pastor of St. Mary's in Gloucester, where he had grown up. Okay, he became it there at such a young age. They had to make an exception for him in the canon of the Church of England rules. Just as a side note, he was the baptized Robert Rakes. Robert Rakes is he's the father of Sunday school. Okay, so so that's a little side note. If you go to the next slide, you will notice that when you see a picture of George Whitefield, next slide will come pretty soon. Well, anyways, when you see this picture of George Whitefield, you will notice his eyes, okay? And in the picture, it looks like he's cross-eyed, and that's because he is. And he would say, I have one eye on God and one eye on the devil. He always tried to make light of everything he had, but he was cross-eyed, and he made no bones about that. He didn't try to cover it up. There he is. Okay. So that was his beginning. Okay. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see. But then when he was there, he said, you know, my mission is to go to Georgia. Now, he went to Savannah. Now, Wesley had just been to Savannah, Georgia. They went to convert the Indians. They went to, now remember, Georgia, you'll remember, Georgia, Florida is occupied by the Spanish, okay? The colonies are occupied by England. So England said, I know what we'll do. We'll make Georgia, we'll put all our prisoners, all those guys we don't like, we'll put them in Georgia. So when Spain invades us, we'll have warning. It's better than a fence, you know? So, and that of course became a great problem, because when we broke away from them, they had to then make their penal colony in Australia. But anyways, so the Georgia didn't have the most reputable people in it. So they would send, so the Anglican Church, the Church of England, would send pastors there to convert the Indians and maybe even convert a few prisoners along the way. Okay. John Wesley had just come back from Georgia, totally demoralized. Okay. He had failed. Okay. There were a lot of other things that went on. One of the things that demoralized him was a young lady that he liked quite a lot, asked her to marry him, but to marry her to somebody else, not to him. He'd be the pastor. And that was sort of demoralizing to him. And there were a few other things going on. So he came, and he just didn't feel he was making any progress at all. So he comes back, and Whitefield takes his place. And when he gets to Georgia, he sees how, you know, the terrible conditions, how people are really poor, but there are also people that are pretty well off. They're in the upper echelons of the English government. And he just, he can't understand this, and he sees all these children that have no parents, some because they died early, some because they were fighting a lot. There were just, tons of children with no place to go. So he said, I'm going to go back to England and I'm going to collect money for an orphanage. Now, this orphanage is the oldest charity in North America. Okay, it's still running today. It's an academy now. But so he goes back to England. He says, I gotta raise money. Now, the Church of England at this time is beginning to realize that maybe he's not the golden light they thought he was, because he's not always preaching to the people. I mean, how much money can you get from a bunch of orphans and okay? It wasn't in the economic plan. So he goes back to England. When he's back in England, he realizes, there are miners here that are in just as much, or in a lot of trouble, maybe not just as much as Georgia. So he's going out and he starts preaching in the open air. And that really gets the church, because then the church doesn't have any control over him. He just goes out and he starts preaching. And people he starts to realize, people like to hear what I have to say. People would come all around, and he would go to the miners before they started work, but people were coming just to hear him. And he would go to London and he'd get 20,000 people just to hear him. He was becoming quite famous. He was getting really good at this, and he could raise some money for his orphanage. So he starts preaching to these coal miners and all these other people, and the church is starting to have a little bit of trouble with him, but it's only coal miners and things like that. But he has this ministry that he goes around, and he says, I got to go back to Georgia to get this thing set up. So he goes to Charles Wesley and both John and Charles, and he goes back to the Wesleys, and he says, someone's got to do this job, because I'm going around preaching to all these guys. Somebody has to take over. No one's there. And John Wesley saying, you're supposed to preach at church. You just can't go out there and just, but Whitefield convinces Wesley to take over. So that's the beginning of our John Wesley's trip, from Bristol around London, and keeps going round and round for the rest of his life until he's close to 90 years old. And that starts this itinerant preacher idea. And what we got in the Methodist Church are these itinerant preachers. Well, this comes from, George Whitefield seeing this need. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Leah, you got it there somewhere. Yeah, it takes a little time. Yeah, it took me a little time to make it too. So, yeah, oh, that's sorry. Okay, so he goes then back to Georgia, and he says, so his by this time his dynamic flair for things, and people see that this guy can really preach. He goes back to the colonies, and he goes and this time he goes and he starts off, he gets the ship to Pennsylvania, pretty close. I mean, you can't, ship doesn't, it's like the airlines, you can't get a place you want to go. He goes to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is a whole lot different than Georgia. Okay, people are a whole lot better off, and there's a whole new sense of things. And so he starts, I mean, where he is, he preaches. Okay, I mean, this guy, he preached 60 hours a week. He didn't write down his sermons. He just talked them all the time. So he's doing all this. He's doing his preaching, and people are coming because they'd heard he'd come in England, and people were coming to Philadelphia, and this was really exciting. But what he walked into is that you had the Calvinist church. Now, Pennsylvania was settled, was William Penn, freedom of religion. So you had the early Calvinists come to the New England, to the colonies. The Puritans, they were all Calvinists, and many of them have moved down to Pennsylvania. But then in the 1680s, you had the Scotch lost their Civil War. They were being repressed. So you had a lot of the Scotch come. In the 1720s, you then had another wave of Irish Scots come that were also Calvinists. And this had a dilemma because you had the so-called old school or the old lights from New England. And they had sort of forgotten what it was like to be persecuted. They were becoming quite comfortable. Okay. They had some money. They were and Ben Franklin would go to his church all the time. And his pastor would preach what we call the prosperity gospel. I mean, what you saw in his writings from Ben Franklin, all these little sayings, a penny saved and a penny earned. This is the way you progressed in life. And life is if you save, if you do well, if you eat right and you don't party too much, you're gonna be wealthy and you deserve that. Okay. The new people coming in from Ireland, they didn't go along with that at all. This prosperity was corrupting them. Okay. And so there was this whole concept here that the Calvinists themselves were divided, and the old Calvinists didn't like what the new Calvinists were saying. The Reverend Samuel Hemphill, that was Ben Franklin's pastor. Okay, and he just loved this guy because Ben Franklin, he was a hardworking guy. He was making a lot of money, and that's what he was supposed to be doing. He could never understand, as much as he was friends with Whitefield and he always had a place open for him, he could never understand why Whitefield was spending his life raising money for an orphanage in Georgia for people that didn't work hard. He could never comprehend that. Okay. Now, I shouldn't say he could never, because there's a lot of signs in Ben Franklin's life that as he got older, he became more enlightened. Okay. But when you read about Ben Franklin in the books, you'll always see he was a deist. Okay, he went to church all the time, but he believed in God, but he also thought, I earned a lot of money because I worked hard for it, and I don't that's the way it is. Now Hemphill went even a little too far for. You can try to change it now, Malia, anytime. Hemphill went a little too far in his theology, and even the old school Calvinists kicked him out. Okay, and Franklin wasn't happy at all. And this is a quote from Ben Franklin. He has some other quotes, but I didn't think I could put them up. But it says, "Asses are grave and dull animals. Our authors, our founders of the church, are the people we follow. Our authors are grave and dull animals. Therefore, our authors are grave, dull, and, if you will, reverend asses." So that was what Ben Franklin thought of this change at the time. And that sort of gives you the tone of what many of the Puritans, after generations of being here, had sort of come to believe. You can change the next one, because I know it takes time. So you have this little, maybe it's a little irrelevant or irreverent, I should say, irreverent talk. And Franklin is really, upset at losing his pastor. At the same time, you had the New Light people. Now, they were first in Pennsylvania, and Gilbert Tennant is, again, born in 1703. He's one of the primary people in this. Now, his father, Samuel Tennant, had come here from Ireland. He was discriminated against in Ireland. He came over here, came with his teenage son, and he started what they call the, I think I have it written down here. Yeah, he started the Log College, and basically the Log College was to educate people into this, what he thought true Calvinism was. Okay. And so what they were saying is, God is the center of everything. We're not. It's not, yes, we should be working hard. We should be but God is the focus. God is the center here. It's not our prosperity. And Gilbert Tennant was a traditional fire and brimstone. Brimstone is sulfur, so fire and sulfur smoking, preacher. And he says it's not a matter of I think I have faith. You have faith because faith changes your life. You just look at everything differently. You're a Calvinist, so a Calvinist, um, I think this is true with all Christians, but particularly for the Calvinists, what they pushed is when the town drunk came up to you, that wasn't a chance meeting. That was a divine appointment. Okay. Now you may have the talent like a Whitefield to preach to him and entertain him for the next hour and a half and change his life, or you may not. Okay. But you need to do something because all of these things are divine appointments. You have your chance, and our job is to spread the gospel, and you have your chance in all these different ways as you walk through life. And he just didn't think that the old life was showing that at all. Okay, so his father, William Tennant, had started this log college to educate pastors into this. That became the College of New Jersey, and that was the College of New Jersey until the city of Princeton went to them and said, if you come here, we'll give you a building and some land. So we now call it Princeton. Okay, so that's the beginning of that was the beginning. And Gilbert Tennant was a graduate of that, and he was the fire and brimstone preacher. They locked him out of the churches. He hadn't gotten the idea that you could preach somewhere other than in a church. Okay, so they let him preach in the country churches, but he didn't get close to a city. I mean, the powers to be weren't going to let him preach anywhere close to a city. So he ended up becoming George Whitefield's handler. Okay, he knew the other pastors in the area. He would go talk to them, say, "You want to talk to this?" He would connect. He would start doing all these connections for him. So every time Whitefield came into an area, the people were prepared for him, and they knew who he was. You can change, but you can change the slide. So he knew that there needed to be a revival. They were all praying for a revival to happen. And when they saw, this is the log college. That's the old version of Princeton before they moved to Princeton. That's the way it was. That's all you had. You can go on to the next one. Next one, Malia. So they all knew that they needed revival. So some of this already said, but so Whitefield starts. Now Whitefield was a worker, like I said. He would talk for 60 hours a week. He would do 1,000 sermons a year. Okay, I mean that's almost 3 a day. Okay, and he had to travel in between, so lots of times he did more than 3 to make up for the time he had to travel. Okay, this guy, 80% of the people in the colonies had heard him, and the colonies, of course, there were a lot of literate people in the colonies at the time compared to the rest of the world, and he had people transcribed his sermons, and then Ben Franklin made a lot of money printing them all off, and they were popular. So you could go to any place up and down the eastern seaboard in the colonies. People knew who George Whitefield was and is. And he was the first, up until that time, if you were in Massachusetts, you didn't care that there were Carolinas, either north or south. They were too far away. I mean, at that time, 20 miles was a long ways to go. Okay. I mean, we have all these towns centered around the church because, they had to get to church on Sunday, and you couldn't go, you only go so far. So there was no concept. And aside from that, Maryland was Catholic. Massachusetts was Puritan. Pennsylvania, they had Quakers. They were free. They had Quakers, they had Calvinists, they had Amish, you name it, they had it. Virginia was the Church of England. You had High Church. So they didn't have anything in common. George Whitefield went up and down, and they found out they had a whole lot in common because they all needed revival, and that's what they thought. And so he was a unifying force in all needing revival. You can go to the next one. I think I'm getting off track here. So on his way to Georgia, he stops in South Carolina. Of course, he's talking when you're doing 1,000 sermons, you take your horse a little ways and you start talking. And he rose a big fuss in South Carolina because now Whitefield and slavery are going to be an issue, but in South Carolina, what he said is the gospel. The gospel needs to be preached to everybody. Okay, slaves are children of God, just like everybody else. Okay, that didn't go over well with his. Remember, he's in the Church of England. That didn't go over well with the authorities in the Church of England. Now, Whitefield gets to be very controversial here because some people like Whitefield and a lot of people don't like Whitefield. Okay. Whitefield, the Church of England was for legalizing slavery in Georgia. It wasn't legalized until I think 1751. They had them, but it wasn't legal. Okay. He signed a paper saying he went along with that. That might have been because he was young and the church was pressuring him. We're not, and this gets even more complicated as we go along here, but there is no question when you read his sermons that he thought that everybody was a child of God, everybody, and he was appalled at how some of these slaves were treated. Okay. So he's on his way to Georgia. Of course, as soon as he says this, word starts to spread like wildfire. So when they get to Georgia, they're ready for this guy. Okay. They want to do him in. But it seemed like, what they estimate was 80% of the people loved him, 20% didn't. Of course, you can guess where the 20% lie in the economic chain. But slavery was a huge issue in pre-revolutionary, in the colonies. I mean, and the Great Awakening was against slavery. And it was basically because of Whitefield's preaching, pointing out the fact that, you're not treating our slaves right. Now, by the same token, people will look at it and say, he will eventually start this orphanage up. And one of the reasons it could economically make it is they use slaves. Okay. So it's a relatively complicated thing. But anyways, what he was saying was, he said, one of his quotes is that when he's talking to the people in his sermons, he said, I'd rather spend money. You would rather spend money on a ball or assembly than relieve the poor, distressed servants of Jesus Christ. You will not be excused because you have a great estate. Okay. And basically the guy down on the bottom there, the John Tolson, who was, he was in the Church of England and was actually in charge of the Church of England for a while. He was pretty much that was one of the things, if you're wealthy and rich, you can get around okay with this. Well, this guy, Hugh Bryant. So Whitefield's banned from the pulpit. But he doesn't care. He goes outside, he's talking to everybody. And Hugh Bryant is a relatively wealthy plantation owner. But everybody's interested in this guy. So he goes there and says, I'll go there because everybody's, dismissing him. And he doesn't, he's too flamboyant. He's all just a showman. There's no real thing there. And Hugh Bryant goes and he hears him and he knows he's wrong. And he changes his life right then. He actually cried for hours. He knows he's wrong. He goes back, and of course he can't free his slaves because there's no place for them to go. So he treats them as employees from here on in. And we're going to hear about him a little bit more. You can go to the next slide. But Hugh Bryant this is the orphanage that he goes down to. So he finally gets down to the orphanage. Now, the other problem he has with the orphanage is he set up a bunch of trustees. These trustees are all, important Anglican people. They don't like him. Okay. But they're going to do their job. Okay. They are trustees of this. They're getting the money. They're going to do their job. And that's what the orphanage looked like at the beginning. I know it doesn't look like much, but this is the first time that these orphans had anything. And at least they got meals, they got a place to sleep, they got a place to stay. They also, being a Calvinist, they also got a practical education. So when they got older, they knew how to be a carpenter. They knew how to be a blacksmith. They wouldn't help them be an electrician, but they knew how to. They had a skill. They could do something, because that's very important in Calvinism, is that you're productive. Okay, you can go to the next one. So he goes from there. He then sails back up to, he's going to go to New England next. Okay, he stops in Rhode Island. They're ready for him in Rhode Island. We're going to get this guy. And I didn't put this part in. So they go up there. They get a famous, at the time, a famous theologian, and he's going to publicly make mincemeat out of this guy who's just flamboyant, doesn't really know what he's talking about. And remember, Whitefield's only 25 years old now, okay? I mean, he doesn't have a lot of experience under his belt. And so they have this sort of public debate, and it didn't turn out the way the theologian thought it would turn out. So Whitefield is going just as strong as ever. He goes out, and Jonathan Edwards now has the church in Northampton. And Jonathan Edwards says, this is exactly what I've been telling my congregation for a long time. When you go to Jonathan Edwards' first talks as a young pastor, Jonathan Edwards was the assistant pastor under his grandfather, his mother's father. Okay, Pastor Stoddard in Northampton, and so he was his assistant when Reverend Stoddard died. He stepped into the spot, and he was very disappointed at not the fact that they were wealthy. Northampton was a wealthy farming town. It wasn't the fact that they were wealthy. It was the fact of how they were using their money after they got their wealth, and he was just very disappointed. And he admitted, so when he heard about Whitefield, he was and remember, by this time, Jonathan Edwards had written the only book at that time that was written in the colonies that was accepted in Europe, that was printed in Europe. He wrote a theological thesis. So people in Europe knew him. Edwards was considered to be a very smart theologian, and like I said, he's the first guy that got accepted into Europe. And just as a side note, because we talked about Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin would be the first scientist to get accepted into the European culture, because with his electricity, he had the idea of plus and minus. But anyways, so we normally think of Jonathan Edwards in his sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which he preached up here in Enfield. If you go up on Route 5 and you look at the old church there as you're going north on your left, he preached that sermon there. Now, these are two different guys. Like I said, Whitefield was this flamboyant, huge voice. He would get his audience to cry. They would laugh. He would do anything to get them engaged in what he was saying, because the whole idea is if he was entertaining, they'd be engaged, and somehow he could slip in that gospel and it would stick. Okay. Jonathan Edwards was nearsighted. He read so you watch him from the pulpit. He was like this, reading his thought, but he didn't have a microphone. Okay, so he's reading it like this. He had kind of a high-pitched voice, and he would do that for an hour and a half. But people were enthralled because they thought it was the words he was saying were so great. Now, when I was in high school, I had to read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And if I didn't have to read it, I probably would not have made it through it. And I haven't gone back to read it since. Okay, so I sometimes have a hard time understanding how they were so much better than me that they could sit through these things without and love it. But anyways, but he being Edwards. Edwards realized that they needed revival, and he'd had a little bit of revival in his community, but he said that's what they needed. And he saw Whitefield as, this is the guy, this is the speaker, this is the flamboyant guy that gets people's attention, and away we go. just as a little side note and when he went to visit, he was up there for 6 weeks up in Northampton, and he just loved Edwards, and he just loved Edwards' family. They were, modest. He pointed out how the Edwards loved his wife, and how the family was so well coordinated, and he wasn't married at the time, and he said, hopefully I'll have a wife like this. But what Edwards often gets criticized about, and it was his undoing, was they had what they called the halfway covenant, because we had this, excess wealth and how to do on this wealth. How do you go into a church when, if you're a Calvinist, you are born again, you are born renewed, you have some kind of this experience somehow. And and people weren't getting this because they were concentrating on their money. So they had the halfway covenant. So if your grandparents had seen the light, well, then the grandchildren could get into the church, even though their parents hadn't seen the light, because that would, it was all in the family. Edwards finally came out against that philosophy, and the church kicked him out. And he went and he spent the rest of his life preaching to the Indians in Lenox and Pittsfield. And then he became the, he then got the job of being president of the College of New England, of New Jersey, which we now call Princeton. But he thought that now that he was going into civilization, he thought he should get a smallpox inoculation. So he did, and it killed him. But so we'll go on to the next. But so what Whitefield was basically saying is it's a poor sermon that gives no offense. So he expected people to be offended by some of what he said, okay, because he was trying to get people to change. So he wasn't upset that it caused offense, and neither does the hearer displeased with himself or with the pastor. So he expected some opposition, and boy, did he get it. So he went on. He went then on to New England, to New York, and he met with a lot of opposition down there too. And what I just wanted to read was, when he said opposition, I just wanted to read from 2 Corinthians. Oh my goodness, we're running out of time. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14. He says, this is from 2 Corinthians, but thanks to God for in union with Christ, we are always led by God as prisoners to Christ's victorious process. God uses us to make the knowledge about Christ spread everywhere like a sweet fragrance. For we are now like a sweet smelling incense offered by Christ to God, which spreads among those who are being saved and those who are being lost. For those who are being lost, it is a deadly stench that kills. For those who are being saved, it is a fragrance that brings life. Who then is capable of such a task? So he understood very clearly that, you can go on to the next one. That he understood very clearly that he was going to get opposition, but opposition was just part of the game. We're almost there. So he goes. So now he in 1744 he goes back. He wants to go back to England, so he goes down to Georgia to make sure his orphanage is doing okay. And Hugh Bryant, come back to Hugh Bryant, he's still down there, and he's writing a letter against slavery, which is going to be against the king, because by this time, with different treaties, England had a great deal of the slave trade. Not too much of it came to the United States, most of it to the Caribbean, but they were the center of the slave trade. And Hugh Bryant was just upset at that. And so he wrote a letter he was going to write an open letter, in the newspaper, because people read newspapers back then. He was writing an open letter in the newspaper saying this slave trade is wrong, okay? And he was against the King of England, and he was against the other authorities in the Episcopal in the Church of England, and he wanted Whitefield to read this before he made it public. So Whitefield read it. Whitefield said, "Yeah, that's a little strong," but he made it stronger. Okay, so they released this letter, and they get arrested, okay, under criminal charges because they were treasonous. They said something against the king. Now, so that puts Whitefield in a bind because his boat's going to leave to go back to England because he's got to get more money. Okay, so he recants. They let him out of jail, and he goes preaching about how bad slavery is and how you have to get and Bryant, he does get himself off. They do not convict him. He gets himself out of the charge. Now, just to sum things up here, because I'm going too long, he makes 13 trips back and forth across the Atlantic. Of course, we've covered 2. We're not going to cover the rest of it, but and pretty much it's this, it's just this circle, just like Wesley was making this circle, and just constantly preaching. His whole task was, and he dies the day after he preaches. And if you go to the next slide, he's buried in Newburyport underneath. And okay, I thought I had another thing up there. What he basically said is I don't want to rust out. I want to wear out. Okay, and he did. He was on a barrel preaching the day before he died, and he asked them to bury him under the pulpit, and that's where his grave is now. It's underneath the pulpit. So what we remember Edwards for is, first of all, he did unite the colonies. The colonies decided to think they all knew this one guy, okay, and he was against slavery, and 80% of the people in the colonies were against slavery. Okay, that was a big focus of the reawakening. The focus was anti-slavery, and that we are, our first allegiance is to God. It's not to the king, it's to God. Okay, and that if we're Christian, then our neighbors all have God's grace, just like we have. And there's not a difference between the slaves and the commoners and the people that own the plantations. And it's, whoever sins is a slave to sin. If the Son saves you, then if the Son frees you, then you are free. Okay, so that's, and sometimes I think when we're going through our dialogue today, if we just remembered some of those things that Whitefield said and thought and did, we'd all be in a better spot, because it isn't, in many ways, it isn't a whole lot different now than it was in 1750. Okay, the last hymn, the last hymn, if it's queued up there, is Because He Lives. Okay, so we can rise and sing Because He Lives. As soon as get the music.